Welcome to our annual horror movie festival. I refuse to speak in a Dracula voice or do anything like that. And anyway, horror movies are kind of not really so much like that anymore anyway. Horror movies more and more show some version of ourselves to ourselves. Maybe they always have. I don't know. I'm not here to philosophize. I'm here to talk about, first of all, the year in horror so far. And we're going to talk in the second segment very specifically about The Substance, which has generated an awful lot of talk. And then at the end, the 25th anniversary of The Sixth Sense is this year, and we are going to talk about that. But as promised at the beginning, we're going to talk to Christian Zilko, a staff editor at IndieWire. Welcome to our conversation.
Thank you for having me.
So there's, kind of a theory about horror movies that has been around for decades, but in many ways is kind of the point of it is kind of sharpened, which is that if you're not dealing in huge numbers, for all the talk of the Marvel Cinematic Universe being played out, Deadpool and Wolverine is like $1.3 billion in worldwide gross. Horror movies don't have to play by those numbers. Ordinarily, you don't pay gigantic salaries to the starring actors. Production costs can often be controlled so that if you can reach the market, the loyal market, you can do well. First of all, feel free to dispute what I just said. But second of all, how are things going that way this year? How is the genre doing in meeting the new demands of kind of a diminishing movie market?
Well, first of all, I think you're completely right. I always say that horror is kind of Hollywood's sandbox, that because these movies can be made at a low budget, because there's a built-in audience, because they don't rely on star power, they have a path to profitability that is much simpler than almost any other genre. And that path to profitability enables creators to do bolder, more innovative things than they'd be able to do anywhere else. This tradition, it goes back to the 1960s. It goes back to Roger Corman giving Martin Scorsese and Francis Ford Coppola their big breaks on kind of cheap exploitation films. Carried on through the 2010s with A24, finding auteurs like Ari Aster and Robert Eggers and using the horror genre to introduce them to mainstream audiences. And I think this year has been a new variation on this age-old trend. I think overall, 2024 has been a good year for cinema, if you look at the whole, if you look at the foreign films and the independent films and the festival films. But just due to the strikes last year and some of the larger trends in Hollywood, the studio slate has been pretty thin. There have not been many of the huge studio blockbusters that really draw in critics and draw in cinephiles looking for something interesting. And I think there's been a void that independent horror movies have filled. I think, if you go back to the Sundance Film Festival, two of the biggest titles that have gone on to become hits throughout the year were horror-adjacent properties. You had Jane Schoenbrun's I Saw the TV Glow, which I thought was brilliant.
It comes on at 10:30 p.m., right?
Yeah, every Saturday night. It's the last show in the block before they switch to black and white reruns for old people. My friend Amanda and I watch it together every week.
Dad won't let me stay up that night. 10 p.m.'s my bedtime.
Damn. That absolutely sucks.
You had A Different Man, which clearly pulled from elements of body horror and has become a huge hit. Going through to Cannes, you had movies like you mentioned, The Substance, that really kind of dazzled some of those prestigious audiences in the world using body horror to make a very smart statement. And then, in the second half of the year, horror has delivered a lot of the box office results that we've come to expect from the genre. I think the first kind of box office triumph of the year was Longlegs, which you can debate how much that is a horror movie, in the same way people debate whether Silence of the Lambs is a horror movie, but it was a satanic serial killer movie that was marketed as an event horror film, and the main draw of the marketing campaign was seeing Nicolas Cage in this horrifying makeup that they refused to reveal until you saw the movie.
Knock, knock on the farmhouse door. A nice lady with a Bible and a congratulations, you have been selected. You may now collect your gift from the church. It says it right here on the orders.
And it just became a box office triumph for Neon that will probably bankroll many, many, many more independent films to come. I think
we should say, that's Longlegs is in 9 figures right now, which is, worldwide anyway. 9 figures it's low 9 figures, but that's a lot. That's a lot for, if it is a horror movie and it does have a name actor in it, which maybe changes the equation a little bit. But yeah, that it really is, at least on a monetary basis, Christian, it feels like kind of an outlier. It probably overperformed expectations a little bit.
Absolutely overperformed expectations. And I think it just proves that the market is there for these event horror movies. That people still want to be scared. People are still willing to take chances on things that are not tied to existing IP if the promise is there. And the promise was there, and the product was there, and it was a huge success.
Yeah, I think, a lot of this is, I'm not a horror fan, but I understand one of the reasons people go there is that there are attempts to surprise and shock us, not just in the traditional sense of horror, but to do something different, try something outside the formula, do something new. That's not always the case. But I think also what happens is the studios look at this and all they can think about is formula. So you've got A Quiet Place. Now, whether those movies are horror movies, I think is something you could have a debate about, but they're horror thriller something movies. It looked to me, Christian, like Never Let Go is Halle Berry in a movie that strikes me as kind of like A Quiet Place. Not exactly. You sort of substitute, a rope or something for deafness, or I don't know. But it seemed like, let's make one of these and then we can make 5 of them the way it's going to be with A Quiet Place.
Yeah, I think you're completely right. And I think that is maybe some misguided logic on the part of Hollywood, where you see a movie that does something truly interesting and new and makes a lot of money. And the lesson should be, wow, we need to do more things that are interesting and new because people will see that. Whereas instead, the lesson becomes, we got to do that exact same thing 5 more times. So I think you're right. I think the parallels between Never Let Go and A Quiet Place are very adept. And, I wish the takeaway was we need to do more exciting things like Long Legs and not we need to make 5 more movies that look exactly like Long Legs.
Another thing that I think has often been a consistent theme in the horror world, it really, I think, goes back decades and decades and decades, is the idea, and I think this is for the core audience, that this is a movie you're just going to try to survive, And this goes back, I think you go back into the 50s, there were advertising, you might get a heart attack, you shouldn't come if you have, some pre-existing medical condition, because that's how scary this movie is. And I feel like one of the things that's been creating a lot of stir are these Terrifier movies. We're up to Terrifier 3 now, and they are accompanied by a lot of publicity about people puking in theaters and fainting in theaters, and an ambulance had to be called to the Chicago screening, and yada yada, and this is not a way to get me to go see a movie, but it seems, Christian, to be a way to get certain people to go see a movie.
Absolutely. To me, the Terrifier franchise may well be the best example in recent memory of creating a new horror franchise from scratch. 3 movies in, this Art the Clown character, this clown that just murders people in the most grotesque ways you can possibly imagine. He's become as recognizable in some horror circles as, a Freddy Krueger, as a Jason Voorhees, as some of these slashers that they've gone back to over and over again. And I think you're right. A big part of it is the shock factor. It is the surviving factor. The first 2 Terrifier movies were made with very, very, very low budgets. And really the story there was the practical effects. It was these just gory, stabbings and dismemberments and these scenes. And they did it without CGI, and they made these effects themselves. And some of the stuff does have to be seen to be believed in all of them. But they got a reputation for these are the movies that will offer you more gore than what you can find anywhere else. And I think Terrifier 3, we're now seeing how a franchise can really grow exponentially when you put in the work of building a fan base over these early movies. And Terrifier 3 had the biggest budget of the series so far, opened at #1 at the box office, which is just insane for a movie of this size. And I saw Terrifier 3 and I was sick to my stomach at times. It's a really, really, really intense thing to sit through. But I think for people that have seen a lot of horror movies and feel there's nothing left that can scare me, there's nothing left, you build up some muscle memory, you build up some resistance, you see some scary stuff, things scare you less, and you're always looking for that new high, and you need a bigger and bigger dose each time. And if there's one franchise that's delivering that in bigger doses, it's Terrifier.
You survived the most famous serial killer since Jack the Ripper. The 5-year anniversary is coming up. I think a lot of people would really like to hear from you after all this time. I want to know what it's like to be in the presence of that kind of evil.
So let's go to the other side of the genre, because one of the things you've written about are these movies, these indie movies that really do have, I think, artistic ambitions. We've already mentioned one of them. I saw the TV Glow. The same director, apparently fond of these kind of Wally Lamb complete sentence titles, also did We're All Going to the World's Fair. Another complete sentence title that's not by her from last year's No One Will Save You. But these are all very I mean, No One Will Save You is this really kind of beautiful looking, wordless, scary movie, but it doesn't make you want to throw up. It makes you think there's something very painterly about it. And you've written about the fact that there's almost a little bit of an uncomfortable fit with these real art movies sitting within the nesting dolls of the horror genre. But say some more about how you see that.
I mean, I think on some ways it's just simple marketing incentives to find audiences for bold films. Art films don't always have a natural place in the current box office landscape, in the streaming landscape. Really idiosyncratic things are often hard to market. And I think a lesson that the industry has learned over and over again is that horror fans are some of the biggest cinephiles in the world. If you're a real horror aficionado and you're seeking out new horror movies, you're often very comfortable with subtitles. You're often very comfortable seeing foreign films from around the world. You're often very comfortable being shocked. You're often very comfortable with bold messages and, strong social commentary. You're often not prudish and you're not expecting a conventional rom-com with a beginning, middle, and end. So I don't know that these filmmakers are necessarily saying, I'm trying to blend horror movies and art house movies. I think there's some filmmakers out there that just have very singular visions for films. And for them, making the film well is the easy part. Getting people to see it is the hard part. And I think there's a decision that a lot of people are making right now, which is to say, I'm just going to kind of place my film and position my film within the horror marketplace. And I'm going to play it at genre-oriented festivals and horror-oriented festivals. And I think what we're seeing is a lot of horror festivals are programming films that aren't necessarily horror, but are films that horror audiences will like. And I think what we've learned, the horror community is always primed for new content, is always primed to find exciting new artists. And one of the best business decisions you can make right now, I would argue, if you're a really singular filmmaker, is to kind of position yourself within that horror community and find that built-in fan base, even if the films you're making are not explicitly horrifying.
But then you also wonder what happens to some of these directors who seem like kind of wunderkinds at what they're doing. I'm thinking about Osgood Perkins, a Nepo baby, but a talented Nepo baby with long legs. Jane Schoenbrunn, you mentioned, with I Saw the TV Glow. Coralie of Harget, we're going to be talking about in the next segment with The Substance. These are very splashy, artistic, interesting directors. And one question is, do you want to keep them down on the horror farm? And do they want to stay down on the horror farm? Do they want to do other kinds of things that break out of the genre? And that's at minimum, I think, kind of an interesting question to watch going forward.
Yeah, I think, one of the oldest tropes in Hollywood is that, actors and filmmakers oftentimes work on the old one for me, one for them system, where you every time you make a really commercial movie, you then get an opportunity to make something more personal that's less obviously profitable. And to me, that might be the formula for these people. You might make a couple of really profitable horror movies, which affords you the opportunity to do something that is not as easily classifiable. And then maybe you get some great reviews for that. But if the box office isn't there, maybe you've got to retreat a little bit. And to me, the obvious case of this in recent years is Ari Aster. His first two movies, Hereditary and Midsommar, truly some of the most commercial things you could imagine. Two of the most profitable movies in A24 history. Really, I would argue he, more than any other filmmaker, helped turn A24 into the financial behemoth that it is within the indie film space. And then for his third movie, he makes this wildly personal, wildly expressionistic, very unapproachable film called Beau's Afraid, which I personally really enjoyed. But I don't really know what you slot it into. It's certainly not a horror movie in any conventional sense. There's clearly no built-in audience for a movie like that. And now for his next movie, he's going back to A24 for what appears to be a much more straightforward kind of, pandemic zombie Western called Eddington. And it would not surprise me if you see more people taking a path like that, where you kind of are able to alternate back and forth between horror movies that are really going to be crowd pleasers and more personal films that are still horror adjacent, but not as easily marketable.
All right. Well, this has been fascinating, and it's something I need to be kept up to date on because I'm not out there in the trenches the way you are. Kristen Zilko, thank you so much, staff editor at IndieWire. We're going to take a little break. We're going to come back. We're going to talk about one of the very talkable movies of this year, The Substance. I want to begin this segment with kind of an apology. I am the kind of host who really doesn't like it when I hear other hosts talk about, for example, a movie or a play, and it turns out they haven't seen it. I just think that's, I don't know, it's weak. I, however, have not seen the movie we're about to talk about, and I'm unlikely to see it, although maybe something that will happen in this segment will make me get over my scruples or whatever it is that I have that is making me avoid seeing this movie. But we're going to talk about a movie that really is one of the most talked about films of 2024. It's certainly a movie that seems to have gotten outside the circumference of the horror genre. There are people who are interested in this movie who might not otherwise be.
Have you ever dreamt of a better version of yourself? Younger, more beautiful, more perfect. One single injection unlocks your DNA, starting a new cellular division that will release another version of yourself. This is The Substance.
So it's called The Substance. It famously stars Demi Moore as an older or aging or something actress / host of a kind of exercise program as well. Margaret Qualley is a younger version of her, and Dennis Quaid as an abusive entertainment titan who, not incidentally, I think is named Harvey. I don't think that's any accident. But after this, I'm going to sort of just throw the Frisbee someplace else because Miriam Balanescu is with us, culture writer and editor, also with us, regular guest on The Nose, Lindsay Lee Wallace, who writes about culture, healthcare, and health equity and other stuff too. But Miriam Balanescu, I'm going to have you get us started. There's, some things we don't mind spoiling, I guess, and some things that we probably shouldn't spoil. But give us an overall sense. I think the bones, so to speak, of this movie are now clear to people who are following it even casually. But just say a little bit about what's in this movie. What's it more or less about?
I mean, this is definitely a movie about aging. It's kind of about what happens to older women in Hollywood, which is a story that has been kind of told quite a lot before in cinematic history. But I guess it has a kind of slightly new spin in that it's also about the beauty industry and kind of what happens when this kind of slightly shady product comes out and, is Demi Moore's character going to use it? And what happens when she does? So yeah, there's lots of parallels to like Botox and Ozempic in there too.
Yeah, I think it really is an Ozempic. I mean, I haven't seen this movie, but what I know of it, it seems like an Ozempic movie, among many other things. And we should say, in this movie, Demi Moore's character is 50 years old. She has turned 50 years old, and she looks great. I mean, she looks terrific. But she's also, by a certain set of artificial standards, Miriam, really, really old, pretty much 1 foot in the grave. She's 50 years old.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, the movie doesn't have much dialogue, but I think one of the kind of main lines early on in the script is, what happens at 50, and it is really kind of all about that. What is the afterlife of this aerobics instructor? Where does she go when she's told she's kind of too old for her job, unfortunately?
People always ask for something new. It's inevitable. At 50, well, it stops.
So one of the controversies about this movie is the degree. Well, let's sort of back up and say that maybe an analogy, and it's an analogy that has been made, I think even by you, is to sort of rape revenge movies. And there's obviously a very feminist way to make rape revenge movies. But then the question is, how much do you dwell on the rape itself? At what point does that become kind of exploitive or exhibitionistic? There seems to be some kind of similar debate going on about this movie, which does not involve a rape, but involves, as you say, body horror. Can you say a little bit about what the argument, to the extent that there is one, is, Miriam?
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, the rape revenge kind of plotline, that's very much more in Farjad's first film, Revenge, aptly named Revenge. And I guess in this film, The Substance, there's kind of a similar thing going on with taking an exploitation movie genre. So a kind of potentially kind of slightly more trashy, for want of a better word, kind of film genres, and kind of trying to do something interesting with it and subverting it. So here, there's very much kind of like just so much gore and grossness, but then that's being used to kind of supposedly purport a feminist message. So kind of, what happens, what's women's relationships with their bodies, body dysmorphia, kind of themes around that, which is something that other female directors are doing. So Julia Ducournau, she a kind of famous French director, her film Titan won the Palme d'Or a few years ago, and that film is also kind of gaining comparisons to this as well.
All right, so let's bring Lindsay Lee Wallace into this, because I think this is a good place for you, Lindsay Lee Wallace, to enter the conversation. This is, I would guess, a movie that you might have had some hesitation about going to, and might have had some hesitation about having gone to it while you were sitting there in the middle of it. But tell us a little bit about just the experience of watching the movie.
I watched like at least the last 20 or 30 minutes of this movie very much through my fingers. I saw this movie with two of my friends, and when we came out of it, me and one of my friends who had both watched it through our fingers were like, I think that the ending really worked for us. And my friend who had just stared at it the entire time was like, I am unwell, I can't. And we were like, well, you weren't supposed to look at it the whole time. You simply absorbed too much. I felt nauseous. I almost was sick. I had to eat a piece of dry toast afterwards, all of which speaks to my particular constitution. But also I thought that it was incredibly impressive. I hope I never see it again, but I thought that it was incredibly impressive.
I watched like 101 Dalmatians through my fingers. I mean, I watched a lot of movies through my fingers. But how does the movie earn your respect, if not your fondness?
Well, first of all, if you watched 101 Dalmatians through your fingers, I think you could handle the substance because no dogs are harmed. So, keep that in mind. But I would say that to me, the ending was like incredibly gratuitous, incredibly violent and disgusting. And I felt like that, rather than being sort of an unnecessary excess, really highlighted the degree of excess that we're kind of forced to contend with when we try to comment on the same issue again and again. Like, it really kind of brought me face to face with the limitations of art commentary as a meaningful tool. It's a film about, like Miriam was saying, ageism and misogyny and femininity and beauty standards and self-hatred when you don't live up to those beauty standards. And there are a lot of films already like that. And it is like sort of an established subgenre with its own conventions and, successful and unsuccessful entries. And I felt like the thing about The Substance that earned it my respect was that in addition to giving me, full body chills in a horrible way, it also made me realize the level of excess that's required to get our attention when we're trying to comment on this issue. And that felt very successful and impressive to me.
Miriam, I'm just going to ask you to react to that.
I mean, yeah, I think I had quite a different reaction to the film, in that it's kind of so over the top, it's so ridiculous that I think it kind of lost me. Yeah, you're kind of drowning in this excess towards the end of the movie, and it's kind of the message kind of gets lost in there a bit, I think, potentially a bit drowned out in all of the spraying blood. Yeah, I think for me it was just kind of a bit muddled and didn't kind of necessarily have anything new to add to the conversation. Like I mentioned earlier, kind of aging is a very well trodden issue in film history, and I don't think it had anything kind of particularly new to say about it.
Miriam, to that point, we should note that the film has been submitted to the Golden Globes in the musical/comedy category rather than drama. And it almost sounds, as you're saying, what you're saying, Miriam, as though it might have verged into that lane, that the excess starts to feel almost satirical or comic in nature. Although, based on all the Lindsay stuff about the dry toast, I'm kind of wondering whether I could join in that sentiment.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think it's definitely a tongue-in-cheek movie. I think it is kind of a bit lost. Like there are scenes that I had problems with earlier on, in that she spends a lot of time kind of focusing on food as well, which was quite an interesting thing to pop up in the film. So lots of cooking scenes and showing how disgusting food is. And then there's also, an issue of sexualizing Margaret Qualley's body as well. And, I think that's something that kind of many have had issues with, this kind of objectifying gaze, and whether she actually does manage to subvert that in the end. So I think even though it is knowing, it doesn't it's not actually kind of a well-controlled kind of satire, I think.
Lindsay, what are your thoughts?
I completely understand that perspective. Like up until the moment that I walked out of the movie theater, I didn't know how I felt about it. And that was one of the places where I hovered as I was covering my face and dreaming about dry toast. But I think that, like, I agree that it's not well controlled, but like the fire hose spray of gore is also not well controlled. And I feel like that's the intention. Like, I think that it turns the dial up to 11 on all of these things, on food, on age, on sexualization, that are handled with this like incredibly, you know, in all of these movies about the issues that the substance also touches on that are described as like important and nuanced and like chilling, which are, you know, movies that I love. There is a certain amount of like, how many important, nuanced, chilling takes can we have on these issues? And then also it doesn't matter at all. And like, what new ground is there possibly to tread artistically around these things? Like, isn't it a little bit exhausting to be at a point where enough of these films exist? And also it doesn't matter, especially when it's not just films about those concepts, but films about those concepts in Hollywood. Like, I think that for fear of delivering spoilers, there is, you know, something that happens in this film that is based on the idea that you can't successfully duplicate a duplicate and you can't Xerox the same Xerox 1,000 times without creating something, you know, horrifying. And I feel like the film itself is horrifying according to its own in-universe rules. Like it's a Xerox of a movie about these serious issues. And that's part of why it's so over the top.
I think it might be also wise to talk specifically about Demi Moore's performance in Miriam. This is an actor who really has, her body has been kind of front and center with a lot of her performances over the course of her career, dating at least as far back as G.I. Jane. But it's getting a lot of attention for a movie that's as hard to watch as this movie is. Her work is getting a lot of attention. You could imagine it being part of certain kinds of awards conversations. Miriam, say a little bit about what you saw her do up on the screen.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, for me, Demi Moore's performance was kind of absolutely perfect. I couldn't fault that. And, you know, for me, that really was the kind of main merit of the film. There's a particularly powerful scene, which I know has already garnered a lot of conversation about, where she is looking in the mirror and she's getting ready to go out on a date and essentially is just over-analyzing her image, her reflection in the mirror, and starts completely messing up her makeup and going kind of, tangles of hair and, you know, streaming mascara and that was really brilliant. And I think actually kind of summed up what the film was trying to say, and maybe everything else was a little bit kind of unnecessary, not really needed so much. So Demi Moore is brilliant in this for sure.
Yeah, Lindsay, I'd love to hear your thoughts about that, but also a little bit about Dennis Quaid, just because I have watched enough clips from the movie to see that Dennis Quaid is also dialed up to 11, 12, or 13 in terms of being this almost kind of comically horrible, abusive studio titan or whatever it is he's supposed to be. But yeah, Lindsay, talk a little bit about the acting.
Yeah, Dennis Quaid made me never want to eat shrimp cocktail again. So that was a very powerful.
It's kind of like how Saltburn ruined for me drinking other people's bathwater. I just don't want to do it anymore. But anyway, continue.
That's an enormous hit to the bathwater industry. I'm sorry. I feel like to talk first about Dennis Quaid. So he plays this disgusting, dialed up to 11 executive who is incredibly misogynistic and, you know, leers at Margaret Qualley and is extremely off-putting. And also Dennis Quaid in real life, you know, recently spoke at a Trump rally in support of Donald Trump, because I think that something meaningful to remember is that no matter what values the film is espousing or what you might believe somebody thinks because they're affiliated with a certain kind of project, that is a direct example of the limitations of art to comment on topics that, you know, Dennis Quaid might not come down on the same place as me when we sit down to discuss it and he's spewing little chewed up bits of shrimp all over me. So I thought he was very impressive, and it also reminded me of the limitations, I guess. I totally agree that Demi Moore was incredible. And Miriam, I love that scene too. I felt like she was extremely reserved at the beginning and really like unraveled in a way that felt very dramatic, but also very relatable. And I also thought, I appreciate the lack of dialogue being mentioned, because I thought that both what Demi Moore and Margaret Qualley did with very few opportunities to emote through lines was really impressive. And I think that Margaret Qualley's performance was kind of like remote because her character is this like avatar of femininity and sexualization. And the relationship between them, like, I felt like the gaze that was on Margaret Qualley more so than being the male gaze is sort of like the gaze that Elizabeth is bringing to evaluating her own body and to evaluating her competition's body. Like, it felt meticulous and practiced and not artificial, but like it felt sexualized in a way that was about, can I live up to this, rather than sexualized in a way that was about bringing me pleasure in the audience as a viewer. And I thought that their back and forth was really impressive in that way.
You know, since you say that, Miriam, I'm wondering also about, it's just sort of luck in a way, if that's the right word. This movie is released and now being seen against the backdrop of a sort of unexpected political contest here in the U.S. between a guy who's just sort of all male gaze and is very weird about his masculinity and very denigrating of women and will often insult the appearances of the wives of other politicians in order to humiliate both the wives and the politicians who don't do anything about it. And now he's rhapsodizing about the genitalia of a dead professional golfer and a woman he didn't expect to be running against, and a woman that he typically would be feel very free to evaluate solely based on her appearance. And I don't know, Miriam, maybe the movie's too extreme to be instructive, but maybe do you see it kind of settling inside the nest a bit of the political climate right now?
Yeah, that's an interesting point. I mean, obviously, Farjat she's a French director, and I do see this being a kind of very French film. There's even a kind of joke in the film about, you know, French cooking nestled in there. So, yeah, I mean, I definitely see that. I think it's released at an interesting time as well, and that Ozempic is obviously becoming a much bigger thing. I imagine kind of when the film was in production, it just wasn't.
No.
But yeah, I guess it's difficult to really say. I mean, I don't imagine that was on Farjat's mind.
No, but it's more just serendipity that this has happened. But yeah, we've got to wrap up now anyway for time's sake. But Miriam Balanescu, thank you so much, a culture writer and editor. Lindsay Lee Wallace writes about culture, healthcare, and health equity and other stuff too, and is with us regularly on the nose. We're going to take a little break. Thanks to both of these wonderful guests. We're going to take a little break. We're going to talk about a movie celebrating its 25th anniversary. That would be Sixth Sense. Spoiler. Anyway, we'll be back. Before we go any further, I want to give credit where credit is due. The technical producer of this episode is the maestro, Dylan Reyes. The producer of this episode is Jonathan McPants. And we are going to finish up by talking about a movie that I have seen, unlike The Substance. And it's 25 years old. It's The Sixth Sense. Here to talk about it is Tim Grierson, a senior U.S. critic for Screen Daily, the author of This Is How You Make a Movie, and the co-host with our old friend Will Leitch of the Grierson and Leitch podcast. Tim, welcome to our show.
Thank you very much for having me.
So The Sixth Sense, we should talk a little bit about just the commercial footprint of Sixth Sense. Horror movies, and this is indisputably a horror movie, they exist kind of within their own ecosystem. They don't really typically break into gigantic box office numbers. The Exorcist is the lone exception, really. But the second closest thing to The Exorcist is Sixth Sense, which became indisputably a mainstream movie despite, the genre focus of it. So say a little bit about why you think that was the case.
I think because even though you're right, it is a horror movie, I think that people who tend not to see horror movies because they're either scaredy cats and that's sort of self-described scaredy cats, or there's somebody who doesn't like a lot of gore and doesn't want to see that type of stuff, they were able to watch The Sixth Sense because yes, it's a horror movie, but it's a story about characters. It's about family. It's almost this like father-son story between Bruce Willis and Haley Joel Osment.
Noticed your eyeglasses. They don't have any lenses in them.
They're my dad's. The lenses hurt my eyes.
What were you talking about with your soldiers when I came in? De
profundis clamo ad te domine. It's called Latin.
And so because of that, it had a suspense element that made it feel more comfortable for mainstream audiences. And also, I think because people started finding out that there was a twist, I think also made people really curious about what that twist was. And the twist was so effective, they then told their friends, oh, you've got to see this movie. It has this incredible twist to it.
And typically when you say that to your friends, you also say, see it soon before somebody blurts it out to you. There's like kind of an urgency to seeing the movie.
Well, it is also funny because this comes out in the summer of 1999. The internet exists, but social media doesn't really exist at that point. It's hard to imagine what The Sixth Sense would have been like in 2024, how you would have kept that twist under wraps really for as long as they were able to. I remember seeing it like maybe a week or 2 weeks into its release, and I didn't know what the twist was. My friends didn't know what the twist was. Back then, it was a little easier to keep these types of things under wraps.
We should say, just in passing anyway, another thing that helped the movie was, I mean, Bruce Willis at that moment is like a really big star. He doesn't know it, but there's several things that Bruce Willis doesn't know. One of them's in the movie, but out there in real life, he really is kind of peaked in a way. He's going to start heading on the downward slope not too long after this, and pretty soon he's going to be in movies with titles like The Expendables, which begins to describe his status at the box office as well. But right now, right at that moment in 1999, Die Hard has had its kind of full run. He's done a bunch of other movies that were either critically exciting or just really good at the box office. So he's somebody who he can open a movie in 1999, right?
Yeah, I mean, he's in the 90s. He's done Pulp Fiction. So he's sort of established his indie cred, cool actor bona fides by working with Tarantino. He's in The Fifth Element, which is sort of a goofy, fun sci-fi adventure that came out in 97. So he's still a star. But I think when we look back on Bruce Willis's career, now that he's essentially retired, sadly, this is sort of a pivot for him doing more serious work. This is like one of the great serious roles that he did. He did not get nominated, sadly, though I think he should have been. But he's kind of balancing between being a big box office star, somebody who can open a movie, and somebody who's also showing, I'm a dramatic actor and I can do this really well. And I think as much as the credit goes to Haley Joel Osment and Toni Collette, who's also great as the mother in the movie, it's really Bruce Willis who sells that movie. The twist in the movie doesn't work if you don't buy what Bruce Willis's journey is in that movie, and he sells that character's journey really, really well.
You were talking about awards and nominations and stuff like that. I mean, it is amazing he doesn't get nominated for that. I mean, the catering people got nominated. It's Best Picture, Best Director, Best Supporting Actor, Best Supporting Actress, Best Original Screenplay, Best Film Editing. Also pretty unusual for something that is ultimately kind of a genre film. And it is, I think, in no small part due to, not only is there a twist, but the movie, it feels aesthetically well made. The director is showing us that he's got some serious directing chops that don't necessarily seem confined to any particular genre, although this turns out to be where he's going to spend most of the ensuing 25 years. Say a little bit more about that, too.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. Like, other than something like, say, Get Out, horror movies don't often, or even like Silence of the Lambs maybe, horror movies don't have much room at the table in terms of the Oscars. You were talking about The Substance earlier, and of course, the question is Demi Moore going to get nominated for that movie? But those movies tend not to get nominated for many Oscars. They can do well, though, at the box office, like you said. The Sixth Sense, though, it feels like more of a prestige picture than I think that we generally think of horror movies. And I think Get Out falls into that category. I think Silence of the Lambs falls into that category. These movies, I like horror movies in general, but they tend to be made on lower budgets. They're more about the jump scares. They're more about kind of just scaring the heck out of you. And while The Sixth Sense has some scary moments, it's more about this idea of, I mean, you can walk into that movie and think it's a drama with horror elements, to be honest. It's shot beautifully. It's directed beautifully. It has a slower pace than what I think maybe hardcore horror fans would expect. And that's the thing I think is also sort of interesting. I think it's almost more of a horror movie for people who don't like horror movies all that much, because it feels more like this drama about this kid who sees dead people. Is there something wrong with him? Can this therapist help him?
Have you ever done any free association writing, Cole?
Yes.
What did you write?
Upset words.
Did you ever write any upset words before your father left?
I don't remember.
It's got those like kind of mainstream sort of things. What I'm interested in, though, is in terms of M. Night Shyamalan, who wrote and directed this. This was also his breakthrough.
Mm-hmm.
Most people did not know who he was. He was a writer for hire at this point. He writes this spec script, and I wrote this piece about this in the LA Times for the 25th anniversary this summer, about the fact that this spec script came into like executives' offices in Hollywood in like 1997 or 98. And people didn't really know who this guy was, and they didn't know what the twist was. People read that script, and I talked to some of the people back then who read the script and thought, this is like one of the best scripts I've ever read. Not even just the best horror script I've ever read. This is the best script period I've ever read. That movie was such a huge hit, and it put him on the map. And we can discuss whether his career since then has lived up to the promise of The Sixth Sense. I think it's been kind of a mixed bag, to be honest. But what a calling card. He had so much power from the success, like people loving that script. He was allowed to direct this movie, which he only like directed one other thing, a really kind of small movie. But the script was so good that essentially the people who bought it said, you get whatever you want. You want to direct it? That's fine. You can direct it. That was part of the deal that M. Night made in terms of selling the script. And he got to make it.
So your piece in the LA Times, it also kind of explores maybe even some of the hazards of taking the world by storm so suddenly, and particularly taking the world by storm partly, and maybe in a way that's slightly overrated. Yeah, the twist is like pretty amazing. It's also amazing because you can watch the movie a couple more times and realize it really doesn't tip its hand, nor does it cheat. But I mean, I think the movie does cohere as a whole, yet your piece in the Times argues that maybe there was a lot of pressure to re-perform the twist. Say a little bit more about how you see that.
Yeah, I mean, it's one of the most difficult things I think that any artist has to face when they're very successful doing something that either no one's ever done or no one's done really well in a long time. There is sort of an expectation from the audience of, okay, do that trick again. And for right or for wrong, I think M. Night Shyamalan, not every one of his movies since then has had a twist, but several of them have. And it has created an expectation, an anticipation in the audience of, okay, what's the twist going to be? Can I figure out what the twist is? The reason why The Sixth Sense works so well, especially for all of us who saw it back in the day, is that we had basically no idea that it was coming. But in the 25 years since then, whether it's M. Night's films since then or other films that have had twists, we have kind of become conditioned to compare it unfavorably to the twist in The Sixth Sense. And there's very rare pieces, I would say, in the last 25 years where a movie's twist ending works really well. To your point, Colin, where you see the film, the twist works really well, and then you watch the movie again knowing the twist, and the movie is still a satisfying experience because in the end, the movie is not about its twist. I think that's something like Shutter Island, which I'm a big fan of, the Scorsese film. The twist at the end of that movie is not what that movie is about entirely, and so you can watch that movie multiple times and understand, oh, Leonardo DiCaprio is not aware of something that we as an audience are aware of, and that makes that movie more tragic. That's the same case with The Sixth Sense, but very few movies can pull that off. Often you can see the twist coming. You feel sort of annoyed that you know that the twist is coming. And I would say that other than Unbreakable, M. Night's follow-up film to The Sixth Sense, he's never come up with any sort of twist that was as satisfying as what he came up with The Sixth Sense. He keeps trying to do it. I think it's diminishing returns for him, unfortunately.
Yeah, on the other hand, it's hard to think of too many movies in the past 25 years that have done twists as satisfyingly. I mean, movies by other people. So there's something very impressive about all of this. You know, Tim, you made a really great point that this movie takes place, this movie is released in 99, which, talk about being dead and we don't know it. We're right on the verge of the social media era, which is going to make a lot of things worse. and
Yes.
and you think about that, what that, you were saying, what would this movie have been in the era of social media? And sort of, what's really impressive is that it really did create a meme. I see dead people, was a tag. We didn't call them memes at that time, but it created something that was portable and durable and applicable to lots of other situations. I'd love to hear what you think about this. I feel like if this had happened in, say, 2015, they would have beaten the meme to death in the first month, and it would have been kind of stale and unpleasant to use after that. There's something lovely about the fact that we still, use this line from time to time.
It's one of the most interesting things about the social media era in terms of how we process movies collectively. It used to be that we would say a movie is very, very quotable. Something like, I don't know, Casablanca or Airplane or Ghostbusters. And we knew all of the lines because we had seen the movie so many times we could quote it. But in the social media era, we don't quote lines so much as we meme them, to your point. We integrate them into TikToks or onto Instagram and make references to other things by then putting a GIF from a movie. And you still see that with The Sixth Sense a little bit, but it kind of exists in this almost Paleozoic era now, where you don't see the types of memes that you would see. M. Night Shyamalan put out a movie this year called Trap. That movie, which was not nearly as commercially successful or critically successful as The Sixth Sense, got memed a bunch simply because the conceit of that new movie was a serial killer who's a dad takes his daughter to a pop concert because she's such a huge fan of the pop star, not realizing that the whole concert has been set as a trap for the serial killer.
I've told you how this is going to work. He's realized he can't get out. He's going to try to cause a panic. He's going to use the chaos of 20,000 people to get by us. He's going to make a bomb call to police or set off a fire alarm. When that happens, only women and children are let through.
In the 3 or 4 months since that movie has come out, there have been so many different types of things I've seen on social media where people say, in reference to real things, oh no, I think this guy is getting trapped, in reference to the M. Night Shyamalan movie. But Sixth Sense doesn't kind of exist in that world. It exists in a world before that. And so if you see somebody and you say, I see dead people, I mean, Kendrick Lamar used I See Dead People in his big diss of Drake song that came out this summer. We still think of it as words that are said. We don't think of it as a meme. If the movie came out now, or even in 2015, to your point, it would be digested in a completely different way. Put it this way, there would be no way for people not to know what the twist is. And I have to say, it's funny that both of us aren't really saying what the twist is in this movie. And I have to say, for my LA Times piece, my editor and I discussed this, and we decided to put a spoiler alert at the front of the article and said, if for some reason you've never seen The Sixth Sense, this article has spoilers about the ending. There's something that still feels a little sacred about how we talk about The Sixth Sense, where it's like most people have seen it, most people know what the twist is, but we're still holding on to the idea that maybe there are people out there who haven't yet, and we don't want to ruin it for them. We want it to be as pure an experience for them as it was for us back in '99.
I think you've just said that so beautifully, and I hadn't really thought about it that way, but I think on the one hand, I got yelled at a few years ago. Ileana Douglas was here on the show, and I made a little joke about the end of Easy Rider, and this guy got really mad at me, and I'm thinking, how old? Do you know Romeo and Juliet? They both die. I mean, at what point is something safe? But I think you're right, that there's a sentimentality that goes on with the deference that we're exhibiting here about the twist that is maybe kind of peculiar to the movie. Tim Grierson, so great to talk to you. Senior U.S. critic for Screen Daily, the author of This Is How You Make a Movie, co-host with our buddy Will Leitch of the Grierson and Leitch podcast. Thanks for your time today, Tim.
Thank you.
And we're going to say goodbye, but, be very afraid. Or don't. I mean, you can just skip all this stuff and you'll be okay as well.